This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Erin Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. Eliza Mondegreen researches online trans and detrans communities where she explores the ways questions and doubts are handled. She also writes about gender medicine for Substack, UnHerd, and other outlets. And here's our conversation with Eliza. Welcome back to Transparency. I'm Aaron Terrell. He is Aaron Kimberly, and today we are delighted to have Eliza Mondegreen back with us for the second time, one of the rare few returning guests. So thanks very much for being here, Eliza. Happy to have you.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to have you back.
We were going to talk about the, originally you were coming on today to talk about your experience at the USPATH conference that happened simultaneously to the GenSpect conference that I was attending. Both in Denver, both early November, and just kind of talk about the what went down there. So we still want to do that, but we also want to talk about some more recent news, which is the New York Times article that Aaron and some other colleagues of ours were featured in. That it's kind of a bombshell as far as progressing the concerns about youth gender medicine, and you wrote an article in response to it. But yeah, anyway. Enough introductions. We'll just go into that.
Okay. I would love to hear more just from Aaron about the process of being part of the article. I think the way that it turned out, it was really nothing that had run in the New York Times before.
I'm really happy with how Pamela handled it, and it was a pleasure working with her. So she reached out to me because she had heard the podcast I did with Megan Daum on the Unspeakable podcast. Mm-hmm. She interviewed, quite a number of us within our social and professional circles. And so she reached out to me just to ask more about what had happened at the clinic where I was working. And that wasn't something I went into much detail into on the Megan Daum podcast. So, and I thought, there was a lot that I told her that was left out of the story for various reasons. But I think she was very thorough in her research, and everything that she said is backed up and documented. And their fact checking, they did multiple levels of fact checking throughout the process. For me personally, she had a separate fact checker reach out to me and just kind of go through my statements, make sure that everything I said was accurate, that they were representing what I said accurately. And they also called my former employer just to confirm that what I said was true and accurate. So I think it was very delicately handled and fact checked. And so I'm really pleased with the process, and it was a pleasure to work with her.
You obviously had a lot of thoughts on the article as well, Eliza. You wrote a bit for UnHerd, kind of deep diving into it.
Yeah, I had one kind of insider question, which you may or may not be able to answer, which was, why was it in the opinion section? Because it seemed like a reported article.
It really did. It was an investigative report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've written a lot of op-eds and nobody's ever fact-checked them. So that seems unusual.
Yeah, I think it was one of those kind of self-defensive moves on the New York Times for sure.
That's kind of how it seemed. I thought it was a really good article. The interviews were really sensitive, and it was really the first article that's run in the Times that wasn't mostly an apologia for writing about it at all. And that was good, and it was encouraging to read so many of the comments. Like the reader comments in the Times articles are always the most interesting part for me, because the readers have seemed so out of step with the paper for a long time. And what I noticed this time was a lot of people in the comments saying that like there was someone in particular who I think Reality Girl on Twitter, she pointed this out, was like, I had been dismissing the things that my son had been showing me from conservative media about what was going on with like transitioning kids. And now I have to eat my hat, basically. I think, well, I hope that this is a moment that a lot of liberals can take a moment to say like, okay, it is really legitimate and not a right-wing crusade to have some serious questions about this.
It does kind of
We'll
also say just how responsible the left-wing media has been in prolonging this scandal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that response right there, it's been like, I could dismiss the reality of all this because my news outlets weren't reporting on it. It's really quite dire, I think.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that was the intent that Pamela expressed to me, was that she was writing from a left-wing perspective, wanting to highlight the fact that the concerns that are being raised about the quality of our care isn't a partisan issue, and that a lot of us on the left are equally concerned. But the debate, unfortunately, because it's become so polarized and divided by left-wing and right-wing interests, the facts are being obscured, right? And then the left isn't willing to listen to the concerns because they think it's a right-wing agenda, which is incorrect. And so I think she accomplished that mission of framing this as there are concerns about a model of care, and that's not a political issue. So it's I was really encouraged by, it seemed like the majority of comments on that article were supportive and very reasonable and in favor of just the return of common sense and our ability to speak openly about these things. And so that reinforced my belief that the majority of North Americans just want common sense and reasonableness and fairness and safety.
Yeah, it seemed like a return to treating it like a normal subject that a reporter might cover.
The only
And
comments that I
it's
saw,
exceptional.
yeah, I mean, I haven't read all the comments because they're
Well, there's
they're
like,
being
are there like
overwhelmed by
thousands?
comments now. But what I was seeing when the last time I read them was that the only few comments that were in opposition to the article were really reinforcing this idea that transition regret is rare, it's 1%, blah blah blah, which is outdated information. I mean, the WPATH standards of care, the last version, the SOC 7. And I looked this up last night. So on page 8 of the Standards of Care 7, does quote that very low regret rate of 1%. But and that's the 1% that everyone keeps repeating over and over and over and over again. It's 1%. But what they fail to mention is that section of the Standards of Care that quotes that 1% describes an older model of care in which patients were carefully screened. And that's why we were seeing a very low percent rate. We can't abandon that model of care. We can't change the model of care, but still depend on this 1% being thrown around. It's really irresponsible to abandon the model of care that resulted in a low percent regret rate, but still have the confidence that our regret rate isn't going to change.
Yeah, and to change the patient population at the same time and say, well, these, it's very questionable how meaningful what patients in the past and patients now have in common is, I think. Yeah, not just what they go through, but just how they got there at all. Yeah. Aaron, what did you think?
Oh, I was blown away by it. I mean, I was just so the thing that stood out to me is like all of the other pieces, even ones that are written by like Jesse Singal, who gets the most flack for covering the subject. It's very much like most people benefit from transition. She didn't do that. She didn't do the most people benefit or the regret rate is quite low, but we do need to care about these people who do regret. It was none of that. It was just straight up, these are the experiences. This is how irresponsible this healthcare model is. And it was just, it was very, I was just, really impressed by the forcefulness of it all. But it being published, a very, very meticulously researched article being published as an opinion piece is
It's weird.
It is. It is. I think one thing that I need to keep in mind, it was kind of evident to me when I was reading Kathleen, whomever, who wrote the apology, essentially,
Yeah.
for the op-ed. I wonder how many parents of trans kids work at the New York Times. How many trans
Yeah.
employees are working at the New York Times? And so it's not just a case of, oh, we don't want to offend our readership. I think a lot of it is very, very emotional internal pushback could also be influencing that opinion.
And
Yeah.
that was the theme that I noticed in the critical comments too, was like people would say like, oh, well, I'm the parent of a trans kid and I'm really offended by this article. And it's like, I'm not surprised.
Yep.
Mhm. Well, Pamela did come back to me after I was interviewed. She came back to me multiple times to just, like I said, fact check and clarify things. And one of the things that she came back and asked was, how did I feel about my own transition? Because it wasn't the intent of the article to say nobody benefits,
Right.
and that, that she wasn't trying to invalidate trans people who are happy with their transition and are just moving on with their lives. And so she came back and asked, how are you feeling about your own transition? So that part was added.
Mhm.
That there are aspects of my care I didn't agree with, but I think I've experienced a net positive, and I'm happy to state that. I'm not going to lie and say that I haven't benefited in any way, but I very much got the impression from Pamela and her editors that they were trying to get the story right, that this is a criticism of a model of care that some people may benefit from, but it's doing harm.
Mhm.
And I think that's the right balance.
Yeah.
And what's really, really impressive that just again that it was Reality Girl who shared that screenshot of that comment from a woman who was saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe this medicine is this," or in quotes, "medicine is this irresponsible. My son's been telling me for years that this is what it is, and I haven't believed him. I'm telling him that his sources are wrong, but now the New
Mhm.
York Times published it. Now I believe it." And so I think that's a kind of probably a common response. Really glad it's finally happening. Much too late, but it's happening. Um, oh crap! I lost where I was going with that. Damn it! Oh yeah, yeah. Just the fact that the whole piece highlighted in a very detailed way how incredibly negligent and non-scientific the healthcare
Mhm.
is, and so many people just assume, like that woman commenting, that there are teams of people, that for different specialists, carefully screening each individual patient to make sure that this is the right course of action. When in reality, you just show up and say, "Hey, I want to transition," and they're like, "Here you go." Like that's the model of
Yes.
care, and
Yeah.
yeah, when people understand that, it's going to change a lot.
Yeah, that was the most interesting part of her comment, was when she was like, I assumed that for something like so much more serious than the ordinary thing I would go to the doctor for, that like, of course they must know what they're doing. And of course they must be, you know, taking every step to assess it and ensure that the treatment is right. And it was just like, and I was wrong. And it was like, yeah, a lot of people are kind of passing the buck in that way, where it's like, somebody has it figured out.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. Somebody understands it.
Because
The
when you
sad
think
thing
about
is
what's
that
really
like
going
Yeah.
on, you
politicians are
sound
doing
like a
that too.
conspiracy, like a
Oh, yeah,
paranoid
you do.
conspiracy
Yeah.
theorist.
Yeah, I don't think people understand that it's a wild, wild west out there, and that clinicians, across the board are practicing in very different ways from clinic to
Mhm.
clinic or office to office. And even in the clinics that are doing this like full on informed consent model, which means you just go in and basically sign a waiver and you get the hormones, that is being practiced in many places. And even in those clinics, I'm sure there are individuals who walk out of there feeling like they've benefited, but those that are harmed are being silenced. And so it's really dishonest to keep kind of promoting this 1% regret rate while actively silencing the voices of anybody that's been harmed. And I was disappointed, but not at all surprised to see some of our legacy organizations like GLAD try to smear the piece, even though the article featured gay and lesbian individuals who are clearly saying, I was harmed by these practices, and our organizations that are supposedly representing gay and lesbian rights alongside trans rights were just completely dismissive of those claims. I mean, they're obviously not. I hope that makes it very, very clear to a lot of people that our legacy organizations are no longer, acting in the best interest of homosexuals.
Yeah, they couldn't even like throw any kind of sympathy toward what Paul and Casey talk about, not being able to accept yourself as being gay or lesbian. They just, it was just so heartless.
The organization that's, Gay and Lesbians Association or whatever against defamation is just committing a shit ton of defamation against gay and lesbian people. It's like Julia Mason points out, it's a completely topsy-turvy, upside-down world where these organizations that were founded to do this or to protect this subset of people are now the ones who are, committing the things they were, formed to defend.
Yeah.
But that's what happens when, as I put it, a totalitarian ideology has taken over these institutions. So, well, do you want to say any more of that about the piece, or do we want to move on to the totalitarian?
I hope there's more like it.
Oh yeah, I think it's one of many to come. It seems.
I hope so. I hope that is the end result of that article. I hope it just opens up a more honest conversation, and I hope it gives other media sources the courage to ask the questions and make sure that we're getting this right. That through the conversation that we start to have some safeguarding and regulation of our healthcare, so that so that we can get back to maybe that very, very, very low regret rate. That we're targeting interventions, that we're doing whole person care, and targeting interventions to very specific diagnosable problems. I mean, that should be common sense in any medical practice, right? Is that clinicians have.
You sound like a really far out crazy person saying that, right? Like.
I mean, the question that I've been asking in response to some of the Twitter meltdowns from the more ideologically captured institutions and clinicians is just asking, well, what is gender dysphoria and how does it develop? Because if clinicians like Jack Turban can't answer that question, they have no business being in part of the care of treating that condition. I mean, if you had a cardiologist who couldn't answer the question, what is cardiac disease, then they have no business practicing cardiology.
Yeah.
So I would encourage anyone who's looking for just some small way, right, to push back, just keep asking that question of these clinicians.
Another promising thing about the response to that article, a lot of people within the LGBT Courage Coalition have been reporting that people that don't know that they're involved in it have been texting them and sending them that article, being like, oh, hey, you'll want to read this, or this is what you've been talking about too, which is kind of really indicative of kind of like a very wide reach amongst the liberal normies.
Yeah. I also want to give just a shout out to our newly formed LGBT Courage Coalition, because several of the individuals, including myself, in the article are a part of the coalition. I know that in the article they link to our Substack account that we've recently launched our website, so we're hoping to get that hyperlink changed so that it links to our website. But we'll post our website in the liner notes here so that people can learn about the coalition and the work that we're doing,
as well as, of course, link to the article and yours as well, Eliza.
Yeah, and you guys have also been having a little bit of fun with the WHO guideline development group. Maybe fun isn't quite the right word,
but some success.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that the WHO didn't really know what they were getting into and that they can be brought to their senses, although I'm not, delusional enough to think that that's the most likely scenario, but we'll see.
I think
Well, I
it is
heard,
possible just because the the WHO is completely international, right? I'm not sure how much of its members are from North America, but it's only going to be a small portion, right? And this seems to be a very isolated to this continent mental disease. I think that there's really the potential for pushback because they're like, okay, we don't believe this nonsense, though. Again,
I
that's
don't
my hope.
know. I mean, I think it is like a Western culture bound syndrome, but then we have NGOs that kind of export those values all over the world. And then those are the people who are kind of like ending up on the guideline development groups and shaping these things. So I feel like it is much more pervasive than it should be. Just within like a certain circle, even though, I mean, the guideline development group for the WHO on this issue, like, they have people from India, from the Indian WPATH, for example, who are espousing these crazy views. And yet you think about like, okay, do you really in India like want legal self-ID when there are such huge problems around like sexual violence and inequality for women? And like there has to be a reality check at some point, but I'm not sure that any of the reality checkers are likely to be the super well-connected NGOs that the WHO listens to.
and maybe I'm naive, but I mean, the way that and we'll link to that campaign with the WHO so people understand what we're talking about. But the WHO assembled a panel that was entirely ideologically aligned, right? Of one way of thinking about these things and very specific things that they're pushing for, which gives the impression that the WHO within the WHO has people that are equally ideologically captured. But I also heard, and I have no way of confirming this, but I heard that the WHO in the public response to that, that they were actually really surprised and gobsmacked by the resistance, which makes me think that organizations like that and our governments and certain institutions are only hearing one message from the LGBT. And so maybe they just assume that supporting the LGBT means that they're listening to this because they think somehow that is representing all of us and all of our opinions and all of our interests, not understanding that minority cohort of activists is actively silencing and coercing the rest of us, right? We didn't elect these people to represent us, that they are pushing a very one-sided ideological position and actively telling the rest of us to shut up. I mean, it's being enforced upon us and not representing our interests. And that, I mean, that was very, like I said, that was very clear to me in the way that GLAAD had a total meltdown over the article is, just smearing this journalist as somehow fabricating things and having this very malicious agenda, even though it was very clear in the article that, lesbians saying, I did this because I didn't want to be gay and I feel harmed and traumatized by this. I mean, so I hope that is a wake up call to the WHO. And I hope similarly our governments start to wake up too, that the people that they're hand selecting, maybe in a well-meaning attempt to support the LGBT, and I appreciate that intent, but they're only hearing from a cohort of people and they're not listening to the rest of us. So I hope that's something that we and other organizations and the LGBT Courage Coalition can start to highlight for the public and these institutions, that we're not all on the same page, that we're not a monolith. We have differing opinions, and many of us are appalled by what's happening in the name of the LGBT. And it takes an enormous amount of courage to stand up to them and to speak our truths, because there is a fallout. And when our own legacy organizations are smearing us for speaking out, there is a cost to saying anything against this current agenda.
Yeah, I think the it was really kind of relieving to see how surprised the WHO was by the pushback, because again, I do think that that speaks to their ignorance on the political division here. And they were literally, I believe, they having been recommended specialists, and a lot of these specialists have PhDs in front of their names, and they're literally out of a place of ignorance going, oh, these are the healthcare, the actual doctors who specialize in gender medicine. They're not thinking these are the people who are ideologically invested in not exploring the actual science of this matter. And so I think, yeah, I think it was kind of out of a place of ignorance. It's like, yeah, then a few of the people on that panel were not at all doctors, such as Florence Ashley, who's purely an activist, and so they cut her, right? And they're like, okay, Florence Ashley's not going to be on the panel, and they're taking, just basically taking a step back to reevaluate the entire situation, because I do think it was from a place of ignorance, literally thinking, oh, these are the specialists of trans care, and these are going to help us form this policy. Yeah, hopefully I'm
so.
Yeah.
missing is literally out of a place of ignorance.
Who are self-appointed experts.
Right.
And we believe them, as you say, we believe them because they have the letters behind their name. But I hope a big reckoning that's coming is against all these people that have basically used their positions. They've used their academic positions, they've used their professions, whether medical or, in the case of Florence Ashley, her legal profession and her position as now a legal professor. They're using their professions, regulated professions, to promote and push a political agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope a reckoning is coming, because I think that is highly unethical for people to use their position as a physician or a psychologist or a lawyer to push their political agenda. And especially in the case of medical professions, not just pushing a political agenda on the public, but they're pushing their political agenda on patients. When is that okay? It's never okay. I mean, I have political beliefs. I vote for certain political parties. I have certain faith-based beliefs, and it's part of my ethics is in my profession to not try to indoctrinate patients into believing my spiritual or political beliefs. And that's exactly what's happening on such a wide scale that, I hope regulators at some point crack down on that, because it's a breach of trust on the public, because we want to believe that we can trust physicians. That's why we have regulators, and that's why we have letters behind people's names, is because the public should be able to trust our professions and our regulators, and that chain of trust has been entirely broken. And that's why it sounds so conspiracy theory-ish, because these institutions that we believe that we can trust have failed us.
Yep.
You have a lot of thoughts your own on the whole reckoning and how it's not going to happen, Eliza, and I hate you for it. But no, I thought for a long time that that reckoning, that I was like, who is the ultimate, who's going to be the ultimate authority who can basically hold WPATH and all these other downstream organizations accountable for this scandal. And I thought that organization would be the WHO. So I was extra concerned. But yeah, you don't think that it's going to happen at all?
No, I don't. I mean, I think one of the things that I take away from the expansion of the concept of gender affirming care is like, okay, right now it's useful to have a really broad definition where we're like, it's okay to tell, a girl that she can wear a dress, and that's gender affirming care, and dyeing your roots is gender affirming care, and shaving your legs and whatever. Right now it lets, activists say, how can you object to this? Like, there are all of these unobjectionable things in this category. And in the future, if we come to a place as a society where we think that this isn't great and shouldn't happen anymore, they'll be able to say, like, well, when I supported gender affirming care, it was always these, like, really innocent, unobjectable things. And I do think that, given the buy-in of so many institutions, and like so many elites, that it will be there will be a lot of people who have an incentive and never looking closely at how this happened, and they will probably get their way. And those of us who had concerns too early will remain problematic because we didn't have concerns at the right time. You know, I just kind of a pessimist in that sense, but we'll see.
I agree with you. I think a lot of people will just kind of quietly walk back on their positions and hope that their
Yeah.
whole past just just disappears conveniently,
Yeah.
while holding resentment to the early whistleblowers.
Yeah. And just so many people will have the same problem that they'll manage it for each other.
Well, that's already happened actually with this wasn't named in the article, but Transcare BC was sort of at the heart of my story, of what happened at my clinic. And I noticed that since SOC 8 has been published, that they've already walked back on, well, even before that, within months of what happened, at my clinic and my public advocacy about that, they already started to walk back, and I noticed that they started to endorse assessment. But then when SOC 8 was published, their website was completely revamped, and now they say, assessment must be done according to, almost saying, this isn't us, guys. Sorry, this isn't us. Don't be mad at us. But SOC 8 says we have to do assessment, and so we have to do assessment. And they took out the line. I got a screen capture of their old website, but where they said that you don't have to be trans to access gender affirming care. They've since removed that from their website. So they're quietly walking back on what they did, and will probably face absolutely no reckoning at all. But then maybe this is a great segue, because when we originally invited you on to talk about being at the USPATH conference. So USPATH is, the organization in the United States is associated with WPATH. So a collection of specialists in this field, self-appointed experts in the field, got together at a conference in Denver, and which you attended. And I think that would actually be a great thing to move into, because as we're I think it will really deepen and highlight our listeners' understanding of that article, and contextualize that when you're in a room with these experts, what kinds of conversations are happening, what kind of education are participants receiving. So I would love to hear what you saw at that conference.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most interesting thing at this point, I've been to 3 conferences. So the WPATH one in Montreal, the European PATH one in Killarney last year, and then Denver. And they're very unlike other medical conferences that I've been to. I used to work in the field of public health, so I was, kind of had a set of expectations going in, and this was just very different. And the best way that I could think of to describe it was that it's kind of this convocation of the faithful in a time when they're under siege, and that the conference is kind of built around the set of parables of like the good gender clinician and the bad gender clinician, and what does a good gender clinician do and what does a bad gender clinician do. And all of the speakers kind of spoke to those 2 types of people, how to not be the bad one, how to, progress further in your development toward being the good gender clinician. And this would look like there were conversations in Denver about leaning into the nuance of capacity. That's a quote. And they would talk about, like, they role played a patient who was autistic, had developed like learning disabilities and developmental delays, was a very young adult, had a schizophrenia diagnosis, had a recent psychiatric hospitalization, identified as a demi boy, and wanted a hysterectomy and a phalloplasty. And they were like, okay, this is something that would make some clinicians uncomfortable. Read, a bad gender clinician would feel uncomfortable with this patient. And we're going to kind of lean into the nuance of capacity and show how, you don't have to be intimidated by conversations around capacity. But then in the process of like role playing, working with this patient,
so
they don't
wait,
actually,
so capacity mean capacity to consent.
Capacity to consent.
Okay.
To some of the most serious surgeries like in this field. And when they're role playing, they don't run into any actual barriers. they're like, the patient didn't understand why the surgery couldn't happen all at once. So we explained it. And then they got it. And it was just, every barrier was just illusory. And there was just no reckoning with the possibility that like, maybe there are some patients who cannot consent to this, either right now or maybe ever. Like there was just this absolute rejection of the possibility that like, maybe it's not right for all patients. And there were sessions about like patients with autism specifically and reviewing all of the things that a clinic could do to make the patients more comfortable. So you can schedule them at the end of the day when the clinic is quieter. You can, turn down the lights because the overhead lights could be kind of distressing. You could have fidget toys, like you could avoid asking them, questions that require more than a yes or no answer. You can avoid like trying to make eye contact so that your patient will be really comfortable. And you can prepare them for the experience of undergoing surgery and like wound care and pain and things like that. But so they're thinking of every possible accommodation other than like, is it ethical to do this at all? And they are just, they're doing this and they are the most effusively like friendly people that you can imagine. And they just can't see what they're doing. They just can't look at it, which is the thing that's always really striking. And as part of like the education into like the good and bad gender clinician, the first full day of the Denver conference started with testimony from a patient who had wanted a mastectomy and who, kind of berates the surgeons in attendance that like no one would provide a mastectomy because the patient was like very, very obese. And because they've considered that to be a surgical risk. And so she said, like, I was only you wouldn't be hearing from me today if somebody hadn't been willing to like break the rules. Good gender clinician breaks the rules to help patients like achieve their embodiment goals. Bad gender clinician says having a BMI of 40 is a huge risk. You need to lose some weight.
I've heard that the similar stories from within, just from a perspective from within the trans community. Because I guess, the surgeon that back, 20 years ago, there was only, I think, one surgeon in BC that was doing the mastectomies. And he was of a similar mind, right? These surgeries don't go as well and don't have the same safety outcomes and aesthetic outcomes if someone is obese. Which is just common sense. But within the trans community, they really rallied around this concept that, that surgeon is fat phobic.
Yes.
And really push back on the surgeon, saying you're just, basically a fat phobic asshole that doesn't want to perform on fat people, and completely dismissing the safety considerations or the aesthetic outcome considerations, because they would have these surgeries and then feel like, that looks strange because now I've got excess tissue under my armpits and or I had infections or it didn't heal as well, and that's why the surgeon said lose some weight beforehand. But he said that to me because I have a little bit of extra tissue under here that our healthcare plan, they're really specific about what they'll cover and what they won't. So they do cover the mastectomy, but they don't cover anything that involves liposuction. And in order to remove some of that excess fat, it has to be liposuction, which they say is cosmetic. And so they don't cover it. And I asked the surgeon about what could I do. He said I could pay out of pocket to have that done, or I could lose some weight. And I didn't have a meltdown, right? Like I didn't have a meltdown. You fat phobic asshole. You should just do it's.
How it's kind of understood within the trans community is that basically surgeons are punishing fat people by denying them the surgery. It's like it's not about their safety; it's about punishing them for being fat. It's
right,
wild.
and that is totally like the mentality. Like you would be punishing this autistic, schizophrenic, recently hospitalized demi boy if you don't give this patient these incredibly serious surgeries because you don't think that they can consent. Like that's not punishing the patient. But that's the mentality.
Yeah, and it's the internal trans culture that is so backwards. Like instead of all that resource, and all that energy you put into your anger about this supposedly fat phobic surgeon, and the letter writing campaigns that happened, and like the phone calls that happened, to push back on that, why not rally around making us healthier people?
Yeah.
Why not have workshops? Why not support each other to eat well and to get to the gym and actually
Yeah.
be healthy?
Yeah.
Well, now
Yeah.
the people that were in the community 20 years ago, absorbing that messaging about that surgeon, right? Those are now the people who are writing these guidelines that say that you're punishing a schizophrenic demi-boy by denying surgery. That like so, that was the thing that I really picked up on at the USPATH, not USPATH, excuse me, the US Trans Health Summit in San
Yes, that you
Francisco.
went to last year.
Yeah, this notion that any um, that any kind of guardrails are discrimination. So that's how it's all
Mhm.
framed. Like any um, just like you were describing with the phalloplasty example. Any any kind of protective guardrail is just reframed as being a means of discriminating, and only the bad gender clinic would discriminate against the poor
Yes.
trans
Yeah. That
people.
like your discomfort or your questioning whether a patient has capacity to consent is like your hang up and you need to get over it and you need to not punish your patients because of these like hang-ups that you have that you can't overcome, which you have a responsibility to overcome. Like that is totally the climate. Um, and since you're mentioning the San Francisco conference, I was of course texting you about this during USPATH and JetSpec that you showed up on the big screen, and I was very surprised to see you at USPATH.
I was just
Well,
down the road.
that's what this has come to, right? Is these organizations are doubling down on their ideological positions and are starting to throw trans people under the bus.
Yeah.
Because it's really remarkable too, because obviously, so Dan Karasik, what he put me up there, right, based to say that I was essentially defaming him, that I lied about things that he said when clearly there's recording of him saying that.
Yeah.
But it's just
It's an interesting
remarkable.
definition of defamation.
It's remarkable how they'll say that this New York Times piece is all full of lies because it's saying that the care being provided has no guardrails, and then they're in their conferences being like, there should be no guardrails. But then when anyone reports on the fact there's no guardrails, they're lying. It's
Yeah. Well, it's like here in Canada, so the province of Alberta. So we now have 3 provinces that are starting to write bills and policies and laws to try to correct some of this overreach of activism. So the province of Alberta was the recent one, and they announced a very comprehensive plan where they are, and I thought the tone of it was beautiful. The premier came out and said, we love and support the trans community. We love and support these kids, but we're not going to allow any medicalization of kids under, I can't remember the age cutoff now. 16, which legally is the age of consent here in Canada. So I think that's why it has to be 16. But they said we're not going to allow medical interventions prior to the age of 16. But for those who, and later in life do transition, we're actually going to improve care. We're going to develop our own surgical team to make sure that care and proper follow-up happens to ensure better outcomes. And so that was all part of this package. And she's being slammed, for being awful and transphobic, and our legacy organizations are going to sue them. And it's just become so, can't remember where I was going to go with that now, but it just becomes so nonsensical that, I remember what it was. So here they are, these activists saying these surgeries never happen to minors.
But you can't ban them.
But if you ban it, they're in an outrage. So
Yeah. One of the other things that really stood out to me from the conference was just how unseriously hormones are taken. So there is maybe a little bit more caution around surgery, but like there were people at the conference who were basically saying, in just a few more words that I'm going to use here, this patient was really like crazy and unstable, but like I thought they were okay to start on hormones. Like they just can't see it as a serious intervention. And then there was a fascinating conversation that was, I think it was not part of the conversation where you came up, Erin. It was like a female gender clinician saying people get hung up on how can we make sure people are really trans and they're not going to regret transition. And she was like, and I'm just not interested in that question. Like, to be very explicit. there was a conversation about maybe somebody raised the possibility of creating centers of excellence in trans healthcare to deal with more complicated cases. And then the response to that from the conference was interesting, because it was like, okay, well, if you say that a case is complicated, that's stigmatizing. And then someone else said, well, if you create these centers of excellence, that would increase inequities. And then the third response was like, but then other providers would seem like centers of not excellence. It was just like, please listen to yourselves.
Was it at that conference where a case was brought up of someone with a dissociative identity disorder and not all of the internal personalities were in agreement?
That was a WPATH.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember if it came up again. Like, it came up around the edges, but the cases of like patients who think that they have multiple personalities and the multiple personalities disagree about what surgeries to get was WPATH, and the answer was like, download an app and get a quorum.
See, these were the kinds of cases that ended up getting me in trouble as a clinician, because of the youth that I saw. I mean, some of them were very straightforward cases where they didn't have layers of other comorbidities, but I would say the majority of these youth were very highly complex. I don't think I saw anyone. No, I don't see anyone with who claimed to have multiple personalities, but I did see people who were in active psychosis.
Yeah.
And referred them on to mental health care, like early psychosis intervention. And I was told I was gatekeeping services. And in some cases, when I would refer someone on to more specialized mental health care, those referrals would be rejected, saying, well, I think you should start them on hormones first and see
if that resolves
their mental health issues. But what does that mean for capacity to consent then? And what I was told by the health authority, because I asked the question, like, when we're assessing, because they do say, they did give us a one-page checklist of things to cover during that assessment. What they said they could be done in a single visit. And they did say one of those things was to ask about their mental health history and any diagnoses they have. But there's no guidance around, okay, so I've collected that information, but now what is my decision-making pathway with that information? And I said, so if someone is severely mentally ill, what do I do with that information? And the response that I got from the health authority was, well, people have a right to be both mentally ill and trans, just like they have a right to be both mentally ill and gay.
Yeah, that was exactly what's come up at all of these conferences, is like, of course, you can be traumatized and still be transgender, you can have multiple personalities and be transgender, or you can be psychotic and be transgender. And like, why would we? It's that mentality of like, you are holding something against your patient if you are trying to protect them because you think they can't consent.
Well, Florence Ashley, in her definition of conversion therapy, she was involved in the drafting of our federal conversion therapy law, and we were successful in changing some of the wording by adding clauses to that law that would exempt and protect clinicians from conversion therapy accusations. So the two clauses that were added was that it doesn't apply to the assessment process when you're discussing medical interventions. So they still allow for comprehensive assessment to be done. And they had a clause that says that therapists are allowed to explore with the client their identity formation and how that, so basically an exploratory therapy, which is just another word for regular old therapy. So that Florence Ashley was unhappy with those limits, because and so she has been very aggressively pushing this idea that her definition of, or their, or whatever his definition of conversion therapy is, the denial of medical interventions.
Yeah. I think the specific request that Ashley had was that people refer to Ashley as that bitch. So if you want to rework that lesson,
which I'd be happy to oblige.
Yeah. So it was an interesting conference. And I was online and not in person this time. I had been in person at the other conferences, and I really regretted that I wasn't able to see people at GenSpect. Would
That
have
would
been
be
nice.
great. Yeah.
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 No, another thing that's interesting about these conferences, so the WPATH or the regional versions of WPATH, is there are clinicians in BC that have been involved in trans healthcare for decades who are now afraid to go to those conferences. So, for example, like endocrinologists who have been, written papers and have served the community for many, many years are now afraid to go to those conferences because of this push to self-identification and full on
Yeah.
just informed consent. They don't want specialists involved in the care. So from that ideological perspective, why would we want an endocrinologist or a psychiatrist involved in our care, right? They just think, no, I mean, any GP should be able to just write us a prescription for hormones or make a
Yeah.
referral to surgeries as a part of, our access to care. So we're now elbowing out a lot of expertise.
Yeah, a lot of the people who are the most responsible, and it really is like it is the death of assessment. Like there was a session where they were talking about how clinicians can dismantle their entitlement to know. So entitlement to know why a patient feels the way they do, or what the relationship between any comorbidities and the desire to transition is. It was just like, you have a responsibility to like get over this and just be an instrument in the hand of the patient.
So they're framing anybody who's curious about how this identity formation or anything. Yeah, it's basically you are expressing an entitlement to know something about your patient, and basically you need to rein that in because that's essentially just selfishness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's long been, a part of the trans culture of this, I would call it paranoia about anyone who's not trans and any clinicians. So you put those two things together, they cisgendered, in air quotes here, a cisgendered clinician is the most dangerous, feared thing possible within our healthcare system. And so I remember, so just to contrast what's happening now to when I went through the system, and even then, so that was about 17 years ago now. So there was a screening process, but even then they were tiptoeing into a more informed consent model long before WPATH went in that direction. Because I was transitioned under SOC 6, which was still endorsing like the 1 year lived experience, where you just sort of try on this identity and negotiate those boundaries with people before any medical interventions are done to ensure that you're really ready. So that was still in our SOC 6, and I didn't do that. So they were clinical practice on the ground has been departing from standards of care for a long, long time. But there was still, when I went through an assessment process, so I was assessed over about a 3-month period by the GP who was working at our gender center. And then before any surgeries, I had to go see a psychologist. And she did quite a lot of screening. She did screeners for all possible comorbidities. So I remember doing screeners for like personality disorders, and I actually found that really helpful, especially now. Like I'm grateful for it now that I'm in the public debate, because of course when you speak out about these things, we get vitriol from all sides and accusations. Oh, you're just mentally ill, and you have a personality disorder. And I actually I've been very well screened, and I know I don't. So. But yeah, so it was a very careful process, and even the surgeon who did the mastectomies, he also did a screener. So I remember filling out like multiple pages of questions, and he was asking about things like sexual fantasies and all these things. And I remember the community being really angry about that, saying, "Oh, the surgeon's just a pervert. He's asking about our sexuality." It's like, have you considered that's actually really important to consider before chopping off your sex organs? Like if you have sexual fantasies of, using female anatomy, and now you're going to rearrange them to, to approximate male anatomy, has it ever occurred to you that you might not be sexually fulfilled? So it wasn't these. So these questions aren't really for the knowledge of the clinician. It's really to help facilitate a thorough thinking process for the patient.
Yeah, and I think to like draw kind of maybe impossible expectations into the light. And I think, the basis of gender affirming care is impossible expectations. Like it seems like that is something that was recognized earlier in trans healthcare, was like, you need to screen patients the way that you would for like body dysmorphic disorder to see if like what they want out of this is remotely achievable.
Mhm.
And that has just gone out the window because it would be gatekeeping.
Yeah. When I did, so I did do, there was a requirement before I had any of the genital surgeries that you had to have a surgical readiness assessment again. So there was the psychologist to screen me before the mastectomy.
Mhm.
And then before the genital surgery, 2 clinicians had to assess me. So they just sat in the same room together. So it wasn't actually 2 separate assessments. And the first thing they said to me when I walked in the room is, "We're not here to say no to you. We're here to support you." And there was zero exploration of what am I hoping to achieve? What do I hope, the end result is? And there was one, actually that isn't entirely true. There was one statement saying that they're finding that a lot of people who had what's called a metoidioplasty aren't satisfied with that result and end up reapplying for phalloplasty. I had already decided phalloplasty for me was off the table. I did not want to do that. So, but yeah, but the rest of it was just more questions about, well, who's going to look after you after the surgery? Is anyone going with you? And those kinds of questions. So there was no pushback, and I wish there had been, and one of the things that I find really appalling, and I don't know why I wasn't a better advocate for myself, but so I ended up having the surgery with Dr. Crane in Texas. And I had been on that surgery wait list for about 10 years.
Okay.
And because we don't have a surgeon, we only have one surgeon in Canada that was doing those surgeries at the time in Montreal. And they had so many complaints about the outcomes of that from that surgeon. And in Canada, our health system is quite different. I mean, Canada isn't as litigious. And so Canadian practitioners don't keep the same stats and report on their outcomes in the same way that American clinicians do. So they lost confidence in that surgeon in Montreal, and that's why they were starting to send us to the United States for these surgeries. And so I had a consultation phone call with Dr. Crane that was a 10-minute phone call. He said, "Do you have any questions?" At that point, I felt like I knew everything I needed to know because I thought my due diligence looking about this stuff online, not realizing how much of that information online is so tightly curated. So I ended up going down to Texas, had the surgery, and it wasn't until after the surgery was done that I was told that I was actually not a good candidate for that surgery based on just my own personal anatomy.
After the fact.
After the fact. And at no point in that 10 years, well, in the last 17 years, actually, like at no point did anyone ever do like a pelvic exam or like just look at my anatomy to advise on whether I was a good candidate or not. At no time. So in that 10 years that I was on the wait list, so I just got to kind of choose which surgery I wanted and what surgeon I could go to. But at no time did any of the clinicians who saw me, including the surgeon, actually look at my anatomy and say, well, okay, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. And just to make sure that my expectations for the outcomes would be aligned with what was actually possible. It
That's
never happened. So it wasn't
how
until
did that never happen? It's just crazy.
I mean, I had determined for myself I was a good candidate just based on things like what has the lower complication rate and those kinds of things. I knew that guys that were heavier set, like obese patients don't tend to have very good outcomes from metoidioplasty just because there's too much tissue in the way. But I mean, I'm only slightly overweight. So I thought, well, that won't apply to me. So I kind of determined for myself with what information was available that I was a good candidate. And it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't until I actually woke up from the surgery that they said I wasn't an ideal candidate.
Did you feel like it only came up then because, I don't know, is it like to protect themselves?
I don't know what that's about. I mean, I think I think part of why I was never examined is because there's this belief that we're all so dysphoric that we never want anyone to look at our bodies until the surgery's done. And so they just never,
Yeah.
they never offered that. And so I wish I had better advocated for myself and kind of insisted that someone kind of check things out and made sure my expectations were sound. So when I came out of the surgery, my wife went down there with me, and the surgeon talked to her afterwards and said, "Okay, this is what happened, and this is what's going to be needed in the future.
Mhm.
So additional surgeries are going to be needed in the surgery to improve the outcome." And then while I was still down there, I had about, I think, 3 checkup appointments, and they also explained to me, okay, this is what we need to do surgically just to improve this. And they were just so confident, right? It's like, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, and you're going to be fine. But when I came back to BC, BC started its own surgical programs. So follow-up care was then done by that team. And I was told I wouldn't be going back to Crane for the follow-up. I would be doing it there at that clinic. And
Mhm.
all the things that Crane said that they would do, this nipping and tucking and whatever, I can't even remember what he said, but there was like 4 things that they said that they were going to do. The surgeons in BC said that wouldn't even be safe to do because it would have compromised the entire blood flow system to my anatomy. So they were very tactfully saying that the work that Dr. Crane is doing, that he's overly confident and
Yeah.
he takes reckless risks.
Yeah.
But it was disappointing because then I was basically being told that the things that were promised to me weren't actually realistic, were safe, and couldn't be done. And so I'm kind of stuck with an aesthetic outcome that I'm not happy with.
Yeah, and it seems like you couldn't consent because it was never made clear what you were like signing up for.
I was clear. The 2 things I was clear about, because I want to be fair about this. I mean, I was warned that strictures and fistulas is a risk anytime you're
Mhm.
basically creating a urethral extension. There is risks that urethral extension will develop scar tissue and close off your urethra, which would be in a medical emergency, or that hookup could fail and you'd end up with
Mhm.
with basically holes in that. So I did end up developing 2 fistulas. So in 2 places, the areas, the graft didn't work and split open. So I was prepared for that. I knew that was a possibility that would happen. But in terms of just the aesthetic outcome and what my expectations were, that was completely unrealistic in hindsight.
It's very much akin, like when you say they didn't want to do, or they tend not to do an exam beforehand just to, avoid triggering dysphoria or whatever. It's very much on the same lines as, oh, when you're bringing in an autistic patient to, clear them for phalloplasty, make sure the lights are low so they're not, overwhelmed by the light. Like it's such, like, let's tend to this really kind of superficial psychological issue rather than this incredibly dangerous
Right, this very
physical.
profound intervention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's protect them from the harms of lighting that's too bright, but
Right, or like being
usher them
expected to
into.
answer a question. Yeah. No, it was really remarkable. And like even talking about patients, like Erin, you got dinged at this conference, like we were talking about for your recording and then proving that Karazak had said some crazy things that he in fact did say. And at this conference, I mean, the same kinds of things were said where it was just like they were talking about nonverbal autistic patients again, and that you should ask yes or no questions so that they can nod or shake their head. It wasn't draw a picture, but it's the same, it comes from the same place.
Right. So what
Yeah.
they're saying, I lied about what they said. They
Right, it
go
was
on and
also
say
part of
the
this
same thing.
conference.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 What they don't seem to understand is that going through these medical procedures is very stressful.
Yeah.
So if you have a patient that is mentally unwell, that that can't handle light that's too bright, but they can somehow handle these very complex social, physical, medical complications. And even though, I mean, I went through all the screening in there, and you've said this too. I mean, you didn't have a lot of comorbidities. I would say I was reasonably mentally well going into these interventions, but for a period when I first started the medical pathway, it was destabilizing because it's so stressful, and you're having to, in a very short period of time, renegotiate your social connections, because the lesbian community that I was a part of at the time, as soon as I announced that I was on testosterone, they're like, okay, you're out. Like, so it was socially destabilizing. It was psychologically destabilizing. I had a 2-week period when I first started the hormones where I was just sobbing uncontrollably. Like, it was just so stressful, and the loss of community and all those things, right? And then you're in this in-between state of, you're not really passing, and you're kind of ambiguous appearing, and that was stressful. I was in nursing school at the time, and I could hear nurses like behind my back talking about, is that a man or a woman? And like, it's stressful. And you're taking someone that's psychologically unwell. I mean, it was stressful for me. You're taking someone with autism or psychosis on top of that, and you're putting them through these interventions and this social experiment that's very, very stressful, and expecting them to do well. And that's just, I don't know.
Yeah.
It makes me angry.
Yeah. And that there would just be this level of like just handling someone with kid gloves until the moment that like you operate on, like, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because the aftercare is notoriously poor. No one's holding her hand. It's not like we're all assigned a case manager. And this is something I really want to see built into the future system, is everyone should be assigned a case manager that really follows them and makes sure, like, are you doing okay? Are you doing proper, aftercare? Catching, infections really early, and if they're not doing well, making sure you have good mental health care. Like, someone needs to be managing that through that entire process. If it's someone's well screened and it's determined that they probably would benefit from this, they still need a lot of support through that whole process.
And that was not part of the conference, any of them. Like, it just doesn't seem to be on anybody's radar to deal with really just to deal with the reality of it.
Yeah,
and the culture,
it's kind of culture. It's an entire culture around disregarding the reality of it. And instead, it's a culture built around a sense of righteousness by discarding reality.
Mhm. And one of the things, like, the USPATH conference had 3 different sessions that were devoted to public relations. And like, that was the main takeaway of the public relations advice, was like, don't be specific with the public about like ages or, what's involved or anything. Like, it's really, really, really disadvantageous for us to be specific. But the thing is that when you are in these spaces among professionals, people who are doing this, as their life's work and are involved in the most intimate details of it, they're not talking about this stuff either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is this, the euphemisms do not start when they go in front of a microphone. Like, it is pervasive, and it absolutely affects the way that people think about what they do. And then there were, not to be all heavy, like, there were moments at the conference that were just like super bizarre. Like, there was a long discussion about the relationship between trans identity and fandoms. So kind of the cosplay conventions, and how gender affirming it could be to walk around in a costume and everybody be praising you for like gender play. And then there was this discussion of like, I would not necessarily call these fandoms, but the person who presented it did. It was like medical fandoms, like the rectal progesterone fandom.
Please elaborate.
Yeah, that's new. I've never heard of that.
I had never heard of that one either. It's apparently, it's a group of men who believe that if you inject progesterone into your rectum, it will have greater feminizing effects.
Basically turn your rectum into a vagina. Is that?
Well,
is that...
They didn't say that, but there were a lot of hopes attached to the rectal administration, and it was just like, is it a fan? Like, should we think about this as a fandom?
Oh, so that's what they're doing. They're essentially saying these kind of cult-like beliefs around medical care. We don't have to combat it or address it. We can just reframe it as a fandom. And that way it's not our responsibility to correct this medical
Right.
misinformation.
Right.
It's just a fandom.
It's this cute little community that has this, it's kind of like the Harry Potter fans, and they have their own, Dumbledore is a time traveling, whatever. And then there's the rectal progesterone fandom.
Right.
And they're all equally medically neutral.
Was there any talk about the eunuch chapter being added to the standards of care?
There was, I'm trying to remember, there was a throwaway reference to one of the most controversial parts of the eunuch chapter. So at the first conference that I went to, which was the WPATH one, where they introduced kind of SOC 8, the eunuch session was the really contentious session, and it was contentious in an interesting way, because what people expressed discomfort with was the language around eunuchs, and not the inclusion, like the concept, the inclusion, the eunuch archive, like all of the other things that you or I might be more uncomfortable with.
They weren't uncomfortable with castrating of people. They were uncomfortable with calling it castration.
They were uncomfortable with calling it castration. Yeah, exactly. They would be like, we always use the terms that try to use the terms the community uses, but the terms the eunuch community uses are just way too graphic. Like, we have a word for this. It's gender nullification. Like, you should use it. And then the only time that I remember eunuchs coming up at USPATH was that there was a throwaway reference to a child who might identify as a eunuch, which was one of the most controversial parts of the standards of care 8, was the suggestion that this could be an innate identity for kids. At the same time that they're presenting research that showed that I can't remember anymore what percent it was, but that a crazy high percentage of these men had been threatened with castration by their parents when they were children, and they didn't think that this was relevant. It was just a curiosity.
Yeah, they present it it was just so weird to include it, right? Because they're saying, a lot of these men who identify as eunuchs or seek castration, you'd think if you want to just keep that an identity, you wouldn't highlight the fact that they often had this traumatic experience as a child of being threatened with castration
by their parents, or that a lot of them were farm kids who participated in castration.
So they include that detail, but ignore that it could be contributing to this.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, science, I think, has ruled out this idea that there's somehow a biological mechanism in our brain that says I am male or I am female. I mean, there can't be a physical biological mechanism that speaks in words. So that is a cognitive process, right, by which we realize I am male or I am female, and what that means in our cultural setting.
Mm-hmm.
But even if there was a biological mechanism that led to that awareness, that could potentially malfunction and get it wrong in some cases, how could there be a biological mechanism that's innate that says I was never meant to have balls, I'm a eunuch, or I was meant to be a cat? Right.
Yeah. Oh, I was part of this. So at my university, there was a talk about 2 weeks ago about plurals. And also, so people who think that they have multiple personalities, whatever they think the origin of that is. And the super woke professor who was talking about her research and was mentioning all of these super questionable things and not explaining them. And she'd be like, you could have a sexual relationship with between the personalities, and you could have some personalities who, were of the same sex, and they didn't get into a sexual relationship for years because of their internalized homophobia. She's saying all this crazy stuff, and then she kind of underbusses the other kin in a way that it's you are gonna want to take this back in 5 years. You're gonna feel like a heinous monster, because she was just we can't, we just can't say that someone doesn't have multiple personalities the way that you can say that somebody isn't a fox, even if somebody is standing there and saying that they're a fox, like some people have said to me. And it was just I don't know, it's just so curious where the lines can still be drawn. At WPATH, it was transracial still bad.
Give it a few years.
Fox still questionable. I know, it's just wait, she's gonna be tearfully recanting all of this. Of course you can be a fox.
Of course, we can dye your skin a darker color so that you can identify as another race. I notice in Canada, a lot of our like forums and stuff are starting to say
Self-identify as.
self-identify as and give a list of ethnicities.
Oh yeah, I noticed that too. Oh, boy.
Any other crazy examples or crazy themes from the
I mean,
benefit of the doubt stuff?
I don't even like there was just it was also just like very unprofessional at times. Like people introducing themselves at a you know, a medical conference as like kinky or as like a triple Capricorn, and it's not a joke. Or they're talking about the like locating oneself as part of the infinite, and it's like this is some medical like there were just a lot of little things where you can see kind of this like overall slippage.
That was
But
at the US at the Trans Health Summit in San Francisco. Each morning, the breakfast plenary was opened with a prayer.
Oh yeah,
a
you
prayer
mentioned
to
this.
the ancestors. It was just like so nobody can really object to it. It's basically just saying, you know, like, oh, we're thankful for the people who came before us, but it's very vague. But it was literally a prayer, and
Yeah,
it was I was standing next to
it's a weird balance.
next to a pediatrician from Berkeley who's we've had on a couple of times to talk about the experience as well. I turned to her, it's like, is this a normal thing at a medical conference to open with a prayer? Like, what the hell?
Yeah,
Yeah, but just they just slide in these little kind of just so religious. It's clearly these people are in need of a religious outlet, and this has become that for them.
and unfortunately, they have done it with medicine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
We do need Jesus after all, turns out.
Yeah.
So
Turns out he was, all things considered, a fairly safe outlet.
yeah. I used to be a Christopher Hitchens style atheist, as I've said many times before. And now, while I do still remain an atheist, I was clearly wrong about that. We need
Humans need something, and
we definitely do.
Seek it in much more dangerous places.
Yeah. We'll find really, really, really self-destructive alternatives to the more beneficial traditional ones, because
I've yet to meet a Christian that went to a doctor saying, "Can you put holes in my hands?"
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being here, Eliza.
Thank you, and hopefully this work we're doing will change things and move the needle. And
yeah.
Thank you for everything you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this and for having me on. It was really lovely to see you guys again.
You too.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.